The most downloaded mod in Terraria is the Calamity mod, and this is for good reason. It's among the most complex mods out there. It really set the standard for good large-scale content mods in Terraria in general, which are already kind of hard to find. With this complexity comes some great boss designs that, when observed closely, show some interesting biological features. These are the features that I aim to analyze in this video. However, I won't be analyzing all of the bosses, primarily because a lot of bosses in this game are actually robotic experiments or based upon magic alone and not biology. However, I will be making future videos that cover them. With that being said, let's look at the Calamity mod and the biology of a cruel world. Our first organism is the Desert Scourge. Looking at its basic appearance, it is an extremely large, light brown worm that has a large quantity of spikes running across its body. It has a webbed tail tipped with 3 spikes and a head with 2 large mandibles and 2 smaller ones below them. Under worm classification, the Desert Scourge would be a polychaete, or otherwise a bristleworm. The spikes are what primarily gives it this classification, as I would assume those to be the chaeta, or lateral chitinous growths from the body, something which particularly defines bristleworms. This specimen in particular shares great resemblance with an earth species known as the bobbit worm. Notably, the bobbit worm is a marine worm, and it shares this quality with the scourge. See, long ago, during the YHARON Crusades, the nearest era of time before the player shows up, YHARON ordered Calamity, the brimstone witch, the one that you fight at the end of the game, to incinerate an ocean known as the Ilmarin Sea, as they were not on good terms with the inhabitants. The destruction that Calamity executed was so severe that the entire sea was converted into a desert. It was just scorched, like it was completely evaporated, with only the lowest depths of the sea being spared from this. This has led to a great and diverse ecosystem that I will definitely cover in a future video, but more importantly, it tells us why an apparent sea worm is currently native to the desert. It is one of the few species to have adapted to desert life following the elimination of its environment. The spikes are the most notable example of this. We see that they are sharp, rough, and abrasive, presumably to help with offense against prey and tunneling through substrates. Previously, these may have been used to more effectively swim through water, as it is with many species of marine bristleworms. Additionally, we see that it has a set of 4 eye sockets. They seem to be empty for some reason, although it could simply be an artifact of lighting, or the eyes could be sunken in, possibly to keep sand out of them, or it could just have no eyes at all. The Scourge's life cycle appears to be that of a standard worm, with it simply growing over time and likely laying an egg near the end of its lifespan. We actually get to see juvenile Desert Scourges, which, as we would expect, are a slightly different color and about half the size. Interestingly, juvenile Desert Scourges are said to hunt in packs alongside the large Scourge. It seems that they are underdeveloped and are somehow at risk of death to another predator. It could also be that they are unable to effectively hunt prey alone, but based on their behavior in-game, I quite doubt this. Rather, I believe that the Desert Scourges must remain in packs at risk of things like dune splicers, a desert worm that can be naturally found during sandstorms. One odd thing, when you kill the Desert Scourge, for one, we see it has red blood, which means that there is a high presence of iron in the body, which is cool, and 2, we weirdly see what appears to be vertebrae, which is uncharacteristic of most worms. This means that the Desert Scourge is, in truth, not a true worm. However, it is likely to be an extremely similar evolutionary analog, possibly an example of some kind of convergent evolution, possibly as a direct result of its adaptation to this new environment. Overall, the Desert Scourge is surprisingly grounded for a giant worm. Yeah, it's still a giant worm, but its design actually makes sense based on its backstory and can be somewhat grounded in real-world biology. Similar cannot exactly be said about our next boss, the Hive Mind. This organism is much more of an oddity. It's not really rooted in any kind of biology, but rather its existence is the byproduct of a dead god. I won't be talking much about the gods of Calamity in this video, as I'm saving it for another, but all you need to know right now is that they are powerful beings who have absorbed RX souls, which have granted them immense power in particular domains. During the time of YHARON's crusade against these gods, the first one that was killed was, as I may assume, killed recklessly. Its killers may not have realized that one must properly dispose of it when it's killed. It seems that they cannot truly die, as following their supposed death, their essence will infest and corrupt every facet that it can. Over time, this infestation will result in powerful beings that attempt to mimic even a fraction of the power of said god. Every corruption monster is an example of this. However, the greatest example of this in the Calamity lore in terms of the corruption is the Hive Mind. If we assume that the original god's domain is also reflected in what occurs upon its death, then the god that resulted in the corruption must have had some dominion over the mind, possibly related to mind control, as its most powerful manifestation is some kind of brain. Regarding its appearance, in its first phase, the Hive Mind appears to be a brain surrounded by a bone-like structure. This bone appears to be purple, possibly a form of demonite ore. The gray matter is a less saturated shade of this purple. It also has tentacles and what appears to be a spine rooted into whatever terrain is available. Along the bone, and presumably lodged inside the gray matter, are a variety of bright green eyes that are constantly blinking and, presumably, rapidly processing as much stimuli as possible. It seems to be a very feral and early phase, as it looks to be desperately looking around, as if it cannot fully process what's happening, which alludes to its nature as the remnants of a god desperately trying to reclaim itself. In its second phase, however, it appears far more calculated in a sense. Its brain's gray matter has opened up morphing into some kind of mouth. The bone structures have revealed a set of more complex predator-like eyes. The tentacles have broken, and in place of them, a set of 4 spike legs. This version of the Hive Mind seems to have recovered as much of its power as it could muster, and has finally gone on the offensive. Overall, the Hive Mind is a great organism that is obviously in place to fulfill the spot of the Brain of Cthulhu from the Crimson biome for the corruption. Very similar can be said for our next organisms, the Perforators. Now, this will be a quicker segment as the Perforators are the Hive Mind's Crimson counterpart. They are still the remnants of a god that YHARON slew that he failed to contain effectively. This god in particular has manifested itself in a kind of brain that has dominion over 3 worms, or an entire species if these individuals are not unique. The Perforator hive itself is a mass of flesh which appears to have veins filled with what is known as ichor. Now, in Greek mythology, ichor is what they call the blood of the gods, which makes a lot of sense when considering its origin. Now, with the knowledge that the corruption counterpart to the ichor is Cursed Flame, we could assert that Cursed Flame is in some way directly related to the biology of the gods, something which we will explore further in a future video. The mass of flesh that contains this ichor has many teeth and seemingly compound eyes that appear to form faces, and a central eye which is likely for more advanced light detection. Extending down from the central mass is a protrusion tipped with an orb of ichor. This may serve as some kind of antenna used to communicate orders to the worms. The first of the Perforators is a small one, a basic segmented worm. It appears to be made of mostly ichor, as it can partially be seen leaking out of its tail end. Its face has 2 small spikes and a large one, which may be a proboscis. It seems that this relatively small worm would feed on the blood or something else of other organisms, or not feed at all, assuming that it's a uniquely supernatural enemy. The second worm is one that is covered in blisters of ichor. It has a dark eye at the top of its head and 2 jaws, which may be a hint toward it having a diet. However, the fact that you can literally split it in half and have it grow another head instantly shows that it's probably supernatural in nature. The third worm is the largest. It's covered in spikes, which may be organized enough for it to be considered a bristleworm. Alongside these spikes, eyes are strewn across the body, the same kind of eyes that the second worm had. Its mouth is composed of 4 jaws and a maw of what may be hundreds of teeth. This worm also leaks ichor across its body. Overall, the Perforators are yet another example of what monstrosities can manifest themselves should one fail to properly dispose of the body of a dead god. The next organism, however, is an example of what happens to organisms that are a result of failure to properly dispose of waste. This organism is the Aquatic Scourge. The Aquatic Scourge is a more traditional bristleworm, one whose natural environment is the sulfuric seas. As its name suggests, it remains part of the scourge worm type, originally living in the Ilmarin Sea. This worm, however, has somehow relocated to the sulfuric sea, which is a sea that was polluted by a few factors, with the most damning being Dragon dumping the waste produced by his mechanical creations in there. As a result, it seems that this worm has adapted to living within the polluted sea. This may not be that different from the original species, as it is far more of a similar environment to a standard ocean than one like the actual desert. We see that it has sets of 4 spikes running along its entire body. Alongside these sets are many holes that seem to function as holes for the Scourge to fire spikes from. Now, one may assume that these spikes are for hunting. After all, they show exceptional long-range capability that would allow for the impaling of prey at great distances. However, in truth, they are an adaptation of self-defense, as in the lore, these worms are said to be filter feeders, a trait which managed to carry over from the original worm due to the similar environment. We see that if we encounter the worm naturally, it appears ignorant to our presence, only taking action when we attack it. Its diet may consist of organisms like krill, or even some elements of the very pollutants that infest its ocean. Overall, the Aquatic Scourge is quite the interesting worm boss that, rightfully so, retreads much of the ground we covered with the Desert Scourge. The same cannot be said for our next organism, Anahita and the Leviathan. A very long time ago, likely during a time near the creation of Terraria itself, elementals began to manifest themselves from seemingly nothing but the very element that they represent. The power of the elementals vary massively, and among the most powerful of these elementals, Anahita rises quite far above the rest. This is not due to an individual power though, as she seems to share this power with her tamed beast, the Leviathan. This beast, based on its description, seems to be relatively unseen. The one that Anahita calls upon is said to either be the last of its kind, or simply conjured into existence by Anahita herself. Now, this Leviathan is obviously a much more suitable subject for a biological analysis, however, Anahita herself exhibits interesting properties. In particular, her arms and legs have been replaced with what I believe can be classified as pectoral and caudal fins, respectively. I have no idea why any elemental would need these structures, considering we can just see her casually flying, but I assume it has something to do with the volume of fish with those types of fins in the ocean, considering they are generally very common in our oceans. As for the Leviathan itself, it seems to be amphibious, or at least recently transitioned from amphibious to aquatic, as it has very clear legs with webbed feet. We also see that it does not appear to have any soft skin, nor does it have any scales that a fish would. With this, we can make a pretty general assumption that this is some kind of reptile, particularly something akin to a gator or a crocodile. More proof of this is, of course, that you can see the Leviathan breathe and be alive above water. As for why it floats, we can assume that it's Anahita holding it out of the water, as something of this scale definitely would not be able to fly. As with most marine creatures, this beast is countershaded, so as to camouflage from organisms above and below it in water, a feature most pronounced on Earth organisms like sharks, but also present in Earth gators. It also fires these projectiles that are often referred to as meatballs by the community. However, in the Calamity wiki, they are referred to as meteors. I'll be honest with you, I have absolutely no idea how it does this. It's an absolute mystery to me, like genuinely, I have no idea. One interesting thing about the Leviathan, though, is that it's not just a new one that is being manifested each time. It's actually, in some way, a pet or a familiar. YHARON takes note of this, calling the bond between the Leviathan and Anahita similar to the one that he has with his own companion. We can see that this is the same Leviathan every time due to the wide array of scars. It would seem that other individuals have challenged Anahita and her familiar in the past and, presumably, failed. An important thing to note is that when we first find Anahita and the Leviathan, they are out of their natural environment. As stated in their lore item, narrated by YHARON himself, they were driven away from the Abyss because YHARON dumped the body of Silva, another god, into the Abyss following the failure to correctly dispose of the previous ones. This still has effects on the Abyss itself though, which again are subject for another video, and thus Anahita had to move away to the Standard Ocean. This may suggest that the Anahita that we see in-game is a far weaker version that what may have lived in the Abyss. Additionally, it may mean that the scars on the Leviathan are actually from various Abyss creatures that live down there. Overall, this has been one of the more natural specimens on the list, and I can definitely say the same for our next organism, the Dragonfolly. Towards the end of the Draconic era, an era where, as the name suggests, dragons were the dominating population, there are records of what we today would call impure dragon species. These are things like wyverns, pigrons, and the subject of this part, the Dragonfolly. Now, one may imagine that after people discovered that the absorption of a dragon's soul would make you into a god, you can imagine what people did after that, which was, of course, hunt them to extinction. Because of this, many dragons sought to hide out of the reach of humans that would hunt them down, and eventually the hunt came to an end. I assume that the survivors were split into two groups, the first being those who were good at hiding, and the second being those who were fittest enough to survive, and it would appear that the Dragonfolly falls into the second category, as it is quite powerful. They are said to hunt prey in the jungle by just using immense static electricity generated by the flapping of their wings against their bodies, which is what causes all the red streaks of lightning to appear around it. Now, I'm not exactly sure if static electricity is supposed to look like that, but I would assume that its soul also interferes with this electricity to an extent. Based on its appearance and the fact that it hunts prey, I think it would be safe to assume that this dragon primarily eats organisms like the Arapaima, which would make the most sense to hunt, as they could just use their electricity on small lakes that can be seen in the jungle. We also have the opportunity to see the juvenile version of the Dragonfolly, dubbed the Draconic Swarmers. They appear to simply be smaller versions of the Dragonfolly itself, with no major differences between the age groups other than in size and detail. On the Dragonfolly's physical appearance, it has 4 eyes, 2 on the left and 2 on the right. Why this is, I am not too sure. If we assume that it was hunted long enough for multiple generations to evolve, which is admittedly a very long time and quite unlikely, it may have evolved so as to more effectively watch for hunters. It may also mean that the color of its feathers also serve as a kind of camouflage, although this does not hold up too well, as in the jungle environments of Terraria there aren't many areas that are of this color. It could also be possible that these impure dragons originate from a desert environment, but there isn't any evidence backing this. The Dragonfolly is quite the interesting, albeit impure, dragon specimen, as it gives us a pretty good outlook into but a small fraction of the power that was present during the Draconic era. However, if we want a real look at the true power of that era, there is only one specimen that we can gaze upon: YHARON, the Dragon of Rebirth. The Age of Dragons had long ended, however, one remained. As a phoenix, and thus the Dragon of Rebirth, YHARON had returned as the last of the auric dragons in the form of an egg. The gods took notice of this, and it was so that YHARON would consume his auric soul, becoming what he himself described as God King. When YHARON refused to consume the auric soul of the dragon egg, he was sentenced to death. YHARON was sent to be thrown into the magma of the underworld, along with the egg itself. However, just before a gruesome death, YHARON hatched from his egg and saved YHARON, hideously scarred from the heat of the underworld. This miraculous event was not the cause for the consumption of a soul, but rather the unification of 2 souls into one, and thus YHARON and YHARON had been attuned to each other. With this, YHARON was able to communicate to YHARON how the gods slaughtered his species for nothing but the power that the consumption of their auric souls provided. And with this, they both swore that justice would come upon the gods, and thus the YHARON Crusades had begun. YHARON, the Dragon of Rebirth, otherwise known as the Resplendent Phoenix, is the purest dragon that we see in-game, being the only one that's not of an impure origin. Its form is adorned in a large amount of red feathers spanning across its whole body, with dots of green. His 2 wings are attached to these 2 flexible appendages which appear to be some kind of keratin. He has 4 legs that have 3 claws each, and on these legs there are a variety of purple shackles, as well as one on his neck. Why these shackles are present, I do not know, because as far as I do know, YHARON is not enslaved in any way. It is important to note that this design is old, and possible redesigns have not included these shackles. If I were to assume a purpose for them in lore, I would assume that it's either an adornment of honor, or something that somehow augments his power. On the topic of his power, a dragon's power over their own domain is said to be limitless, and YHARON's domain is the Great Primordial Light. And if I'm being honest, I'm not too sure what the Great Primordial Light is, as the only information we really have about it is that it quote-unquote banishes the eternal night beyond. Regardless, we know that his power manifests itself in huge towers of the Inferno, and so-called flare attacks such as the Flare Bomb, Flare Dust, and Flare Tornado. Notably, YHARON seems in some way to be related to the Dragonfolly, as we see he also has 2 eyes on each side of its head. It could be possible that the domain that the Dragonfolly is related to may be in some way related to the Great Primordial Light. Now, as I said before, this design is quite outdated, and is probably more related to the old lore. We can see in more modern designs that YHARON appears to be a lot slimmer and has no shackles. Overall, YHARON is the being with the most immense power out of every organism that we have covered, and thus, this analysis ends with him. Okay, so as I said earlier, I'm not going to analyze all the bosses of Calamity in this video, as that would be a video so long it would overshadow everything I've ever made in size combined. However, a future and shorter video will come out covering the specifics of Calamity regarding the gods, the beings who consumed the Auric souls of the dragons. And if you want to see a particular boss or even enemy that I did not cover here in a future video, leave a comment and I'll see if I can make a video dedicated to them alone. And that brings me to the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching to the end. If you enjoyed this video, you'll probably like my other biological analysis, which you can find here. If you have anything you'd like to add about the biology of these organisms, please put them in the comments. And with that being said, thanks for watching, and goodbye.